When money gets tight, that's the first thing that goes, because if you're going to choose between security and classification and programming, what do you think will win out 100% of the time? Security and classification. You got to keep things safe. I don't blame them for that. It's one of the reasons that we have such a high return rate. Those first sets of decisions, assessment, classification, and prison programming should be captured in a transition. In a transition accountability plan. In the general literature here, that transition accountability plan, or a TAP in Louisiana, that is called the Reentry Accountability Plan, or the REAP. And I am suspicious there's a biblical overtone for that. The REAP, Reentry Plan. That reentry plan should communicate to the prisoner, to the people who work in the system, what's expected. If I do this, I get this. If I don't do this, I don't get this. And if I keep my nose clean and I am compliant and I attend my programming, I'm going to move through my security levels and I'm going to be released at the earliest time. That motivates me, and it's in writing, and you can hold it. I went to a prison in Michigan. I was the chief deputy director of the prison system in Michigan for years. And I went into a facility, and as I did, I asked all the staff to leave, and I met with a bunch of prisoners. And in the prison unit I was in, folks had a medical history of drug addiction and a mental health history. And of these men that I met with, there were about 7 of them. 5 of them were holding these gray folders to their chests throughout the entire meeting. Sat down, I said, so how's it going? They talked to me a little bit. A couple guys talked more than others. What's the most important thing that's going on? Well, you know, we're getting introduced to people in the community, people caring about us. They talked about people caring about us. And at some point in the interview, I said to them, I said, so what is that you're clutching? And this guy, I'll never forget the look on his face. He was so wonderful. He looked at me and he said, this is my new life. In here, I have all my letters I've sent to the employers. I have my resume. I have my journal, and it was a thick folder. I have my re-entry plan. This is my new life. This is where I keep everything. He owned it. He carried it. And what the staff did was make sure that he was working on that. So this idea that you get ready right away for release, prisoner reentry happens the first day you're committed into the state prison system. It actually should start at sentencing, when we've got access to the people before they get uprooted and sent somewhere, and we can get copies of their IDs and the stuff that they're going to lose in the 8 years that they're down, but that's a whole other story. No state has ever been able to do that well. But that transition planning happens here, and then immediately before release is the second phase. And when that second phase hits, we want to make sure that people are really, really ready to go home. That's when we move these men, beginning with the men. We're going to be working with women. The women are all housed in one location way up north. I don't even know if it's in this state. It's so far northeast. So a little more difficult because there's fewer women, but we're committed to working with women as well. Yeah. Well, the reentry center up there. In the old juvenile facility. They found a facility that they liked, and so they moved all the women in, nowhere near their communities at all. It's what departments of correction. What's that? Is that it? So, when we move the men to West Baton Rouge, beginning with small numbers, we're going to start doing this release preparation. And this is what we have to guide us. These are the kinds of materials. I'm just going to mention them here. This isn't a real deep dive in paperwork here. But we have a Department of Corrections policy that indicates what's expected. The Secretary will sign this soon. Once we've got all the policies lined up to it, it's the overarching Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Policy, and it indicates in writing what's expected here, here, and here. have to comply with HIPAA rules and regulations. It's easier to do than folks make it out. Very good question. Do you hear a question back? Are we going to at some point be given rosters of people that are getting out so we know? And the answer is yes. Right now, nobody knows that. Nobody knows everybody who's getting out of prison and what their risk and need levels are and what their date of release is. Some people know some things, some people know other things. There's no system in place. We don't even know right now how many people are in prison from East Baton Rouge and what their risk and need levels are, so we have an idea, let alone when they're getting out and at what pace. This is all part of what we're trying to improve. We cannot implement this overarching policy without getting clear about that, and we can't expect the community to do a comprehensive reentry plan unless they know what is the average number of releases per month, of not the highest of the high, we do want to know that, but the lower end of the highs that we're going to work with, our sweet spot in the moderates, so that we know who's getting out, we know who's going to be moved to the center, we know when they're going to be moved to the center, and when we get there, we're welcomed with open arms, and they don't say, "Who are you with again? The Wood? We ain't got nothing in here. I'm sorry." Right? It's got to get tight. That's why we're doing the cohorts, the testing, to try to get tight on it. So as we start to implement this, this is the general layout of the model. I'm going to give you some more specifics. Know that we have this overarching policy that lays this stuff out, and that overarching policy references what the outcome expectations are that you had asked about, Pastor. It lays out what the organizational structures are, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Lays out the case logic about how the cases are supposed to flow. Describes how we expect for cases to be managed collaboratively with parole, following collaborative case management. We have reentry accountability planning documentation that's expected to be completed, and other types of documentation. It's all captured in that policy. And in one sense, when we think about implementation, implementation can be simply put, we're going to implement this overarching policy. I'm going to touch on some of these, and you will have access to that policy in all of its detail. But I'm telling you that what that policy represents is this idea that these transition plans, Pam, you had asked about the risk assessment being living, breathing, yes, but part of a broader living and breathing document, which is a reentry plan. Because when you're in prison, let's redo the room, phase 1, these folks are all in prison. Phase 2, these folks have moved closer to home. Phase 3, these folks are in the community. We need to know what's happening in phase 1. What does that transition reentry plan look like? What programming have they participated in? Who's visiting them? Who's connected with them? What do they got going? What are the pluses? What are the risks, right? And then closer to release, how do we put that together and make sure that members of the community have access to be able to meet with the men and women coming out, understanding who they are, what they need, and saying, I'm going to get you pre-enrolled or enrolled. So you hit the ground on day 1. I want to know, with this group here who are just getting ready to get out, I want to know what you're doing the first 2 minutes after you're out, first 2 hours, first 2 days, first 2 weeks, first 2 months. And if we're clear about that, the odds are greater you're going to do well, because failure begins immediately and then slowly but surely ebbs into this. That's what this policy dictates. How do we go from a policy that says we're going to do it to getting it done? That's a long path. One thing we know, in places we've worked, you don't do it with massive numbers of people, you will fail. You've got to kick the tires and test it out. We were down in St. Tammany. The first group of men was 11. It didn't follow the model very well, frankly. The men weren't clear as to why they were there. There weren't re-entry plans ready to prepare. We got down to 1 guy. And that guy said, I don't need anything, I'm good. So we're going to start over. And we're going to get it right this time. We're not going to spread into Caddo or East Baton Rouge until we do. And it's got to work well. We can't make this work with 10, 15, or 20, because God knows we're never going to make it work with 200, or whatever that number is, because I really don't know the number. I suspect in the state of Louisiana, very strong suspicion, we have a very large number of low-risk people who are in prison. Very large number. Who may have more needs, but probably don't represent that seriousness of a risk. That's just a suspicion. So, once that plan is started while they're still in prison, that reentry accountability plan, they're released, they meet with their parole officer, and then we continue that plan in terms of what the expectations are for reporting, attending different programs, etc. That's what it's supposed to be, and there is a reentry accountability planning document that I am told I will have in my hands on the 23rd of February when I meet in St. Tammany with the group of people that are looking at what happened with this first cohort and saying, man, all that stuff you promised,